Okinawa, April 16, 1945, 0600 hours, and Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Minobe of the Imperial Japanese Navy stood on the camouflaged observation post overlooking Naha harbor, watching through his binoculars as American Vought F4U Corsairs approached from the northeast, their distinctive inverted gull wings catching the first rays of sunlight, when suddenly he noticed something peculiar beneath their wings. Something massive, far larger than any rocket or bomb he'd seen before. Cylindrical. Objects that seemed almost comically oversized, like flying telephone poles, and before he could even process what he was seeing, the lead Corsair released one of these monsters, the rocket dropping briefly before a brilliant flame erupted from its tail, sending it screaming toward the Japanese coastal defense position at over 500 miles per hour, and when it struck the reinforced concrete bunker that had withstood weeks of naval bombardment, the explosion was unlike anything Minobe had witnessed, the entire structure not just exploding but seemingly imploding from within, chunks of concrete the size of automobiles flying hundreds of feet into the air, the blast wave knocking him backward despite being 800 meters away. The rocket, Minobe would later learn from captured American documents, was called the Tiny Tim, an ironic name for something so devastatingly massive, an 11.75-inch diameter rocket weighing over 1,200 pounds with a warhead containing 148 pounds of TNT, essentially a flying torpedo that could be launched from a single-engine fighter, and this revelation shook the Imperial Japanese Navy's understanding of American capabilities to its core, for they had prepared for bombs, prepared for conventional rockets, prepared even for the increasingly frequent kamikaze attacks by their own forces, but they had never imagined the Americans would develop something that combined the destructive power of a battleship shell with the precision delivery of a fighter bomber, a weapon that could turn every Corsair and Hellcat into a flying artillery battery capable of delivering devastating strikes against the most hardened targets. 3 months earlier, in January 1945, Vice Admiral Mato Magaki had reviewed intelligence reports about American rocket development with considerable skepticism, sitting in his headquarters at Kanoya Air Base in southern Kyushu, dismissing the photographs of American fighters carrying what appeared to be oversized rockets as either propaganda or experimental weapons that would never see practical combat use, telling his staff officers that the Americans were desperate, trying to intimidate Japan with theatrical displays of impractical weapons, and besides, Japanese engineers had calculated that rockets of such size would be impossible to launch safely from single-engine fighters without destroying the launching aircraft itself, a problem the Germans had encountered with their own large-caliber rocket experiments, and Agaki was confident that Japanese defensive positions, particularly the massive concrete fortifications built throughout Okinawa and the home islands, could withstand any aerial assault short of the heaviest naval bombardment. Captain Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactical planner who had helped design the Pearl Harbor attack, had actually warned about American rocket development in a December 1944 assessment, noting that captured intelligence from the Philippines campaign suggested the United States Navy was developing increasingly powerful air-to-ground rockets, but his warnings were largely ignored by senior commanders who believed that Japan's layered defensive strategy, combining kamikaze attacks, conventional air strikes, and heavily fortified positions, would prevent any new American weapon from significantly affecting the outcome of the coming battles, and Genda's specific concern about reports of super heavy rockets being tested at American naval air stations was dismissed as unlikely given the technical challenges involved in launching such weapons from carrier-based aircraft. The development of the Tiny Tim had actually begun in 1944 at the California Institute of Technology, where American scientists had solved the launch problem that Japanese engineers considered impossible by developing an innovative drop-launch system where the rocket would fall away from the aircraft before igniting, connected by a lanyard that would trigger the rocket motor only after achieving safe separation. But Japanese intelligence had no knowledge of this breakthrough, continuing to believe that the laws of physics and engineering that constrained their own rocket development would similarly limit American capabilities, a fatal miscalculation that would cost them dearly in the final months of the war, as the Tiny Tim represented not just a new weapon but a fundamental shift in tactical air power, allowing single-engine fighters to deliver the kind of devastating strikes previously reserved for heavy bombers or naval gunfire. Commander Masafumi Arima, before his death in October 1944 during one of the first organized kamikaze attacks, had actually theorized about the possibility of large-caliber aerial rockets in a technical paper, arguing that if such weapons could be developed, they would revolutionize naval warfare by allowing aircraft to engage warships from beyond anti-aircraft range, essentially turning fighters into long-range artillery platforms, but his ideas were considered too futuristic by the naval general staff, who pointed out that even Germany's advanced rocket program had not produced anything approaching the size and power Arima was describing, and the consensus among Japanese military engineers was that the technical challenges, particularly the stability and accuracy problems inherent in large rockets, made such weapons impractical for anything beyond area bombardment. The Japanese Navy's encounter with American rocket technology had begun gradually, first with the 35-inch forward-firing aircraft rockets that appeared in 1944, weapons that were concerning but not revolutionary, causing damage certainly but nothing that fundamentally changed Japanese defensive calculations. Then came the 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, or VARs, which the Americans called Holy Moses. And these were more troublesome, capable of penetrating light armor and devastating aircraft on the ground, but still within the parameters of what Japanese planners had anticipated, rockets that enhanced American firepower but didn't fundamentally alter the tactical equation. And so when intelligence reports began filtering in about something called Tiny Tim, many Japanese officers assumed it was simply another incremental improvement, perhaps a 6-inch or 7-inch rocket, never imagining the Americans had made the leap to 11.75 inches. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, Japan's legendary ace who had survived grievous wounds earlier in the war, was stationed at Yokosuka Naval Base in February 1945 when he attended a briefing about American weapons development, and he later recalled the dismissive attitude when an intelligence officer mentioned reports of giant rockets being tested by the Americans, with senior officers laughing at the idea, one admiral joking that perhaps the Americans planned to strap wings to their 16-inch shells, and Sakai himself, despite his respect for American industrial capacity, found it hard to believe that rockets larger than the German Nebelwerfer derivatives could be practically employed from fighter aircraft, as the weight and recoil issues alone seemed insurmountable, not to mention the danger to the launching aircraft from the rocket's blast. The reality of American industrial capability, however, far exceeded Japanese estimates, for the Tiny Tim program had access to resources that seemed almost fantastical from a Japanese perspective, including repurposed oil well casing pipes that were already being mass-produced for the petroleum industry, allowing the Americans to manufacture the rocket bodies without straining their military production facilities, while the warheads were adapted from existing 500-pound semi-armor-piercing bombs, and the rocket motor used 4 modified charges from the existing Holy Moses rocket program, essentially combining proven components in an innovative way that bypassed most of the development challenges that would have taken years to solve from scratch. A quintessentially American approach that prioritized practical results over engineering elegance. Meanwhile, at the Kure Naval Base, where the remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy's once mighty fleet lay at anchor, Rear Admiral Keizo Komura, commanding the light cruiser Iodo, flagship of the combined fleet, reviewed defensive preparations with growing unease, knowing that American carrier strikes were inevitable but believing that the concentrated anti-aircraft defenses around Kure, combined with the natural protection of the surrounding hills and the sacrificial courage of kamikaze pilots, would prevent any decisive damage to the remaining warships, and certainly no one imagined that American fighters would soon be delivering warheads equivalent to 12-inch naval shells with pinpoint accuracy, weapons that could punch through the armored decks of cruisers or devastate shore installations that had been considered immune to anything short of sustained battleship bombardment. The first confirmed use of Tiny Tim rockets in the Pacific had actually occurred during the preparatory strikes for the Okinawa invasion, though initial Japanese reports were so incredible that they were dismissed as exaggeration or panic, with one coastal defense unit claiming that American fighters had destroyed a reinforced concrete ammunition bunker with a single rocket, a claim that seemed physically impossible given what Japanese engineers knew about rocket warhead limitations, and it wasn't, until multiple units reported similar incidents, describing rockets of unprecedented size that seemed to burrow into targets before detonating with devastating effect, that senior commanders began to realize they were facing something entirely new, a weapon that invalidated many of their defensive assumptions. Captain Toshiharu Inaguchi, senior staff officer for kamikaze operations, wrote in his diary on April 18, 1945, that the appearance of these monster rockets, as Japanese pilots had begun calling them, represented a psychological blow almost as severe as their physical impact, because they demonstrated that while Japan was reduced to turning its pilots and aircraft into human-guided missiles in desperate suicide attacks, the Americans had developed weapons of equal or greater destructive power that could be employed repeatedly by the same aircraft and pilot, a stark illustration of the growing technological gulf between the two nations, and Inaguchi worried that knowledge of these weapons would further demoralize Japanese forces already struggling with the reality of American material superiority. The attack on the Japanese destroyer escort Amatsukaze on April 22, 1945, provided a shocking demonstration of the Tiny Tim's anti-ship capabilities. When a pair of Marine Corsairs from VMF 312 caught the vessel near Okinawa, and the destroyer's captain, Commander Masao Yamashita, initially confident that his ship's maneuverability and anti-aircraft guns would protect against conventional bombing, watched in horror as the Corsairs released their rockets from well beyond effective anti-aircraft range, the massive projectiles streaking toward his ship at tremendous speed, and though one rocket missed, passing just meters from the stern, the second struck amidships, the warhead punching through the hull before detonating inside. The explosion so powerful that it lifted the entire midsection of the destroyer, breaking its keel and dooming the vessel in a matter of seconds, taking 93 sailors to their deaths. The psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel was immediate and profound, for here was a weapon that negated many of their defensive advantages. Rockets that could be launched from beyond anti-aircraft range with accuracy comparable to dive bombing but without exposing the attacking aircraft to the concentrated fire that had protected Japanese vessels throughout the war, and unlike torpedoes which could sometimes be evaded or whose damage could be controlled through skilled damage control procedures, these rockets struck with the speed and inevitability of naval gunfire, and their warheads, designed to penetrate before detonating, caused catastrophic internal damage that was almost impossible to contain. Petty Officer Yoshio Nakamura, a survivor of the Amatsukaze sinking, later testified during American interrogations that the crew's first indication of attack was the sight of the rockets themselves, appearing like flying telephone poles wreathed in flame. And by the time the anti-aircraft guns had swiveled to track the Corsairs, the rockets had already been launched and were inbound, the entire engagement lasting less than 30 seconds from first sighting to impact, and Nakamura described the helplessness felt by the crew, trained to defend against conventional air attack but completely unprepared for weapons that combined the range of naval gunfire with the accuracy of dive bombing, delivered by single-engine fighters that would have been considered minor threats just months earlier. At Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the reports about these new rockets sparked fierce debate, with Army officers arguing that the weapons were likely limited in number and effectiveness. Experimental systems rushed into combat that would prove unreliable, while Navy officers who had seen their ships destroyed argued that the Tiny Tim represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power, allowing American tactical aircraft to function as flying heavy artillery, and Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, father of the kamikaze program, reportedly stated that these rockets proved the Americans had solved the problem Japan had attempted to address through suicide attacks, namely how to deliver massive explosive payloads accurately against hardened targets. But they had done so through technology rather than human sacrifice. The industrial capacity behind the Tiny Tim program was something Japanese planners could barely comprehend, for while Japan struggled to produce enough conventional ammunition for its remaining forces, scraping together resources for each kamikaze mission, the Americans had developed a production line that could manufacture these massive rockets using repurposed industrial materials. The oil well casings that formed the rocket bodies were being produced at a rate that would have consumed Japan's entire steel allocation for aircraft production, yet for the Americans this was merely redirecting surplus industrial capacity, and each Tiny Tim rocket contained more explosive power than most Japanese fighter bombers could carry in conventional bombs, yet could be mounted to an aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, stationed at Kanoya Air Base, witnessed a demonstration of American rocket power during a raid on May 13, 1945, when Marine Corsairs attacked the airfield's reinforced hangars, structures that had been built to withstand conventional bombing and had survived numerous B-29 raids with minimal damage, but the Tiny Tim rockets performed like bunker busters, punching through the concrete roofs before detonating inside, and one hangar containing 6 precious Zero fighters simply ceased to exist, replaced by a smoking crater, while another rocket that struck the runway created a hole that took Japanese engineers 3 days to repair, damage that would have required dozens of conventional bombs to achieve. The Japanese Navy's attempts to counter the Tiny Tim threat proved futile, as the rockets could be launched from ranges that made anti-aircraft fire ineffective, and their speed, over 500 miles per hour, made them nearly impossible to track visually once launched, while the psychological impact on gun crews, seeing these massive rockets streaking toward them, often caused panic and reduced the effectiveness of defensive fire even further, and several Japanese officers reported that their men had begun calling the rockets flying torpedoes or aerial long lances, comparing them to Japan's own feared Type 93 torpedo but acknowledging that the Americans had achieved through air power what Japan had perfected in surface warfare. On Okinawa, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, senior staff officer of the Japanese 32nd Army, noted in his operational diary that the tiny TIM rockets had rendered many of their carefully prepared defensive positions untenable, particularly the coastal defense guns that were essential to preventing American naval forces from operating close to shore. For these positions, built into caves and reinforced with concrete, had been considered impervious to anything short of direct hits from battleship main guns, yet the rockets could be delivered with surgical precision by fighter bombers operating from escort carriers, turning every American flat top into the equivalent of a heavy cruiser in terms of shore bombardment capability. The attack on Japanese shipping in Naha harbor on April 28, 1945, demonstrated another devastating application of the tiny TIM, as Marine Corsairs from VMF 312 and VMF 323 caught several transport vessels attempting to unload supplies under cover of darkness, and the rockets proved devastatingly effective against the thin-skinned merchantmen, with one witness, Captain Ichiro Tanaka of the transport Nisho Maru, describing how a single rocket tore through his ship from stem to stern, the warhead detonating in the engine room and breaking the vessel in half, the entire ship sinking in less than 4 minutes, taking with it desperately needed ammunition and food supplies intended for the defenders of Okinawa. The technological disparity represented by the tiny TIM was particularly galling to Japanese naval engineers, who understood the sophistication required to develop such weapons, from the metallurgy needed to create rocket casings that could withstand the tremendous pressures and temperatures, to the propellant chemistry that could generate sufficient thrust without destroying the rocket, to the aerodynamic design that maintained stability despite the weapon's massive size, and perhaps most impressively, the innovative launch system that allowed these monsters to be deployed from single-engine fighters, a solution so elegant that Japanese engineers admitted they had never even considered it possible. Rear Admiral Minoru Maeda, chief of the Naval Aeronautical Department, convened an emergency meeting on May 2, 1945, to discuss potential countermeasures to the tiny TIM threat, but the assembled engineers and tacticians could offer little beyond dispersal and camouflage, acknowledging that Japan lacked both the industrial capacity and the time to develop comparable weapons, and that their anti-aircraft defenses, already strained to the breaking point by conventional attacks, were simply not designed to counter weapons launched from beyond their effective range, leading Maeda to conclude in his report to the Naval General Staff that the tiny TIM represented a difference not of degree but of kind in American tactical capabilities. The most devastating demonstration of tiny TIM effectiveness came during the July 1945 raids on Kure Naval Base, where the remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy lay at anchor, essentially immobilized by fuel shortages but still possessing significant firepower in their anti-aircraft batteries, and Rear Admiral Miki Otsuka, commanding the battleship Nagato, had positioned his ship deep in a cove at Yokosuka, surrounded by anti-aircraft positions and believing that any air attack would have to run a gauntlet of defensive fire, but when the American strikes came on July 18, the tiny TIM rockets changed everything, with one rocket, possibly a dud according to some accounts, punching completely through Nagato's hull, while the psychological impact on the crew was devastating, realizing that their mighty battleship was vulnerable to weapons carried by single-engine fighters. The attack pattern employed by the Americans was particularly demoralizing, as the Corsairs and Hellcats would approach at high altitude, beyond the reach of most anti-aircraft guns, then dive briefly to launch their rockets before pulling away, never entering the killing zone that Japanese gunners had been trained to exploit, and the rockets themselves, once launched, were essentially unstoppable, their solid fuel motors burning for just seconds but accelerating them to speeds that made evasion impossible, while their semi-armor-piercing warheads could penetrate even the armored decks of heavy cruisers before detonating, causing catastrophic internal damage. Lieutenant Kazuo Tsunoda, an anti-aircraft officer on the cruiser Ioto during the Kure raids, described the futility of trying to defend against tiny TIM attacks, noting that the rockets were often launched from distances of 2,000 meters or more, well beyond the effective range of 25 mm anti-aircraft guns, and by the time the larger 127 mm guns could train on the attacking aircraft, the rockets were already inbound, their speed and relatively small size making them nearly impossible to hit, while the psychological effect on gun crews, seeing these massive rockets streaking toward them trailing bright flames, often caused them to abandon their positions despite orders to stand fast. The impact on Japanese morale extended beyond the immediate tactical effects, for the tiny Tim represented everything that Japan could no longer achieve: massive industrial production, technological innovation, and the ability to project devastating firepower without sacrificing pilots or aircraft. While Japan was reduced to kamikaze attacks that traded lives for limited tactical gains, the Americans had developed weapons that achieved greater destruction while preserving their trained pilots. An expensive aircraft, a sustainable approach to warfare that Japan could no longer match, leading many Japanese officers to privately acknowledge that the war was truly lost. Commander Toshiyuki Yokoi, a staff officer with the 5th Air Fleet, wrote in a post-war memoir that the appearance of the tiny Tim rockets in early 1945 convinced him that Japan faced not just quantitative inferiority but a qualitative gap that could never be closed. For while Japanese engineers struggled to keep existing aircraft flying with increasingly scarce materials and fuel, the Americans were fielding weapons that seemed to come from a different era entirely. Rockets that turned every fighter into a flying artillery piece, guided bombs that could strike with unprecedented accuracy, and proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells that made Japanese air attacks virtually suicidal. The production statistics for the tiny Tim, when revealed after the war, staggered Japanese officers who learned that the Americans had manufactured thousands of these rockets despite their size and complexity, using industrial techniques that Japan could never have replicated even at the height of its power, including mass production methods that maintained consistent quality while achieving production rates that would have required Japan's entire munitions industry to match, and the fact that these rockets were just one of dozens of new weapons systems the Americans deployed in 1945 drove home the hopelessness of Japan's position. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, who had commanded the center force during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, observed during interrogation after the war that weapons like the tiny Tim validated his decision to withdraw during that battle. For if the Americans could develop such devastating tactical weapons while simultaneously maintaining their advantage in numbers and training, then any conventional naval engagement would have been not just defeat but annihilation. And he noted with bitter irony that the kamikaze program, which he had initially opposed, seemed almost rational when faced with such overwhelming technological superiority. The attack on the Sasebo Naval Base on August 9, 1945, the same day as the Nagasaki atomic bombing, saw some of the last tiny Tim rockets fired in anger during World War II, as Marine Corsairs from Task Force 38 struck the few remaining operational Japanese vessels, and Ensign Takashi Yamamoto, watching from a hidden observation post, described the strikes as mechanical and merciless, with the rockets destroying a submarine depot and severely damaging 2 escort vessels with clinical precision, the attacking aircraft never coming within range of the base's substantial anti-aircraft defenses, turning what should have been a costly attack into a one-sided execution. The psychological warfare aspect of the tiny Tim was not lost on American planners, who ensured that Japanese forces were well aware of the weapon's capabilities through dropped leaflets and radio broadcasts, describing in detail how these flying battleship shells could destroy any target, penetrate any bunker, sink any ship, and the knowledge that American fighters could deliver such devastating firepower contributed to the collapse of morale among Japanese forces in the final months of the war, with many officers privately acknowledging that resistance had become not just futile but meaningless against such overwhelming technological superiority. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived the war, reflected in his memoirs that the tiny Tim rocket represented the ultimate expression of American industrial warfare, a weapon that was simultaneously crude in concept, essentially a giant rocket, and sophisticated in execution, requiring advances in chemistry, metallurgy, and aeronautics to make practical. And he noted that while Japan had started the war with superior aircraft and tactics, by 1945 the Americans had so completely reversed the situation that Japanese forces were like samurai with swords facing an opponent with machine guns. The Imperial Japanese Navy's final assessment of the tiny Tim, prepared for the post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey, acknowledged that the weapon had achieved tactical effects far beyond its actual employment numbers, destroying critical installations, sinking valuable ships, and perhaps most importantly, demonstrating to Japanese forces the futility of continued resistance against an enemy that could develop and deploy such weapons while simultaneously conducting operations across the entire Pacific, and several officers admitted that the appearance of the Tiny Tim and similar advanced weapons in early 1945 had convinced them that Japan's defeat was not just inevitable but imminent. The story of the Tiny Tim's impact on Japanese forces reveals a deeper truth about the Pacific War's final phase, that beyond the atomic bombs and massive B-29 raids, it was weapons like these rockets that demonstrated on a daily basis the growing technological gulf between the combatants. For every Japanese soldier and sailor could understand the implications of fighters carrying rockets larger than anything in Japan's arsenal, weapons that could destroy in seconds fortifications that had taken months to build, and this tangible demonstration of American superiority, repeated in engagement after engagement, eroded Japanese morale more effectively than any propaganda. Rear Admiral Somu Toyota, the last chief of the Naval General Staff, testified after the war that the Tiny Tim and similar weapons had rendered Japan's defensive strategy obsolete, for all their planning had assumed that American forces would have to come within range of Japanese defenses to deliver effective attacks, whether through conventional bombing, naval gunfire, or ground assault, but weapons like the Tiny Tim allowed the Americans to stand off at safe distances and systematically destroy Japanese capabilities with minimal risk, turning the final battles into what he called a form of execution rather than combat. The technical specifications of the Tiny Tim, when fully understood by Japanese engineers after the war, revealed just how far American weapons development had advanced. For the rocket's 24-nozzle motor design, which provided stable thrust despite the weapon size, was beyond anything Japan had attempted, while the mechanical time fuse that could be set to detonate at specific depths after penetration showed sophistication in ammunition design that Japanese industry could not match, and the fact that these complex weapons were reliable enough for routine combat employment spoke to quality control and manufacturing standards that Japan had never achieved even in peacetime. Lieutenant General Torishiro Kawabe, Deputy Chief of the Army General Staff, admitted during post-war interrogations that the Army had severely underestimated the impact of American tactical weapons development, focusing instead on strategic bombing and conventional ground forces, and that weapons like the Tiny Tim had made many of their defensive preparations irrelevant, particularly the extensive fortifications built throughout the home islands, which were designed to withstand conventional bombing but would have been vulnerable to precision strikes with rocket-delivered heavy warheads, essentially negating years of preparation and countless tons of concrete and steel. The financial cost of the Tiny Tim program, when revealed to Japanese officers after the war, seemed almost unbelievable, for the Americans had spent more on developing and producing these rockets than Japan's entire naval aviation budget for 1945. Yet this represented only a tiny fraction of American military expenditure, driving home the reality that Japan had challenged an industrial giant capable of pursuing dozens of advanced weapons programs simultaneously while maintaining conventional forces that already outnumbered and outgunned Japanese forces by orders of magnitude. Commander Yoshimatsu Nakajima, who had helped plan the defense of Kyushu for the anticipated American invasion, noted that the Tiny Tim had invalidated many of their assumptions about American assault tactics, for they had expected that coastal defenses would force American naval forces to maintain significant standoff distances, limiting the effectiveness of pre-invasion bombardment, but with fighters able to deliver 12-inch caliber warheads with precision from escort carriers operating well offshore. Every cave entrance, every gun emplacement, every command post would have been vulnerable to systematic destruction before the first landing craft approached the beach. The contrast between Japanese and American approaches to warfare was never starker than in weapons like the Tiny Tim, for while Japan sought to overcome material disadvantages through spiritual superiority and human sacrifice, epitomized by the kamikaze program, the Americans applied industrial logic and technological innovation to create weapons that achieved superior results while minimizing human cost, and this fundamental difference in philosophy, made tangible in every Tiny Tim rocket that streaked across Pacific skies, demonstrated why Japan's defeat was not just military but civilizational, a collision between two incompatible approaches to modern warfare. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey revealed that Tiny Tim rockets had destroyed or severely damaged over 40 Japanese vessels, from destroyers to merchant ships and countless shore installations, but these statistics only partially captured their impact, for the psychological effect on Japanese forces, the demonstration of American technological superiority, and the erosion of defensive confidence were arguably more significant than the physical damage, contributing to the collapse of organized resistance and the eventual acceptance of unconditional surrender. The irony that a weapon named Tiny Tim, suggesting something small and insignificant, had delivered such devastating blows to Japanese forces was not lost on post-war commentators, who saw in this naming convention typical American confidence, the ability to joke about weapons that represented revolutionary advances in military technology, and several Japanese officers admitted that this casual attitude toward such powerful weapons had been deeply demoralizing, suggesting that the Americans had such superiority that they could afford to be flippant about weapons that would have been considered wonder weapons by any other nation. Captain Takaichi Kanashi, one of the few surviving destroyer commanders, reflected that the Tiny Tim had made his entire tactical doctrine obsolete, for destroyer warfare had always depended on speed, maneuverability, and firepower to protect against air attack. But rockets that could be launched from beyond gun range with the hitting power of cruiser shells meant that destroyers were essentially defenseless against determined air attack, and he noted with professional admiration that the Americans had solved in months a problem that had plagued naval tacticians for decades: how to deliver heavy ordnance accurately from aircraft without exposing them to defensive fire. The last recorded Japanese military assessment of the Tiny Tim came from Admiral Somu Toyoda in August 1945, just days before the surrender, when he noted in a staff meeting that weapons like these rockets made continued resistance not just futile but suicidal. For Japan had no answer to American standoff weapons that could systematically destroy defensive positions without risking valuable assets, and he reportedly stated that the appearance of such weapons in early 1945 had convinced him that Japan's only options were surrender or annihilation, with no possibility of negotiated peace from a position of strength. The legacy of the Tiny Tim in Japanese military memory remained powerful long after the war, with veterans describing the distinctive sound of the rockets, a screaming roar that announced incoming destruction, and the sight of Corsairs and Hellcats carrying these massive weapons became symbolic of American material superiority, featured in countless memoirs and historical accounts as the moment when individual Japanese officers realized that their nation's defeat was total and irreversible, not through grand strategic battles but through the accumulated weight of tactical encounters where American technology rendered Japanese courage irrelevant. In the final analysis, the Tiny Tim rocket represented everything that Japan had failed to anticipate about American warfare: the ability to rapidly develop and deploy revolutionary weapons, the industrial capacity to produce them in meaningful quantities, the training and logistics to employ them effectively, and perhaps most importantly, the intellectual flexibility to solve complex technical problems through innovative approaches that seemed impossible to those constrained by conventional thinking. And this single weapon, arriving in the war's final months, encapsulated why Japan's defeat was not just military but total, a comprehensive demonstration of American superiority in every aspect of modern warfare. The story of Japan's encounter with the Tiny Tim rocket serves as a powerful reminder that in modern warfare, technological superiority can render traditional military virtues like courage, discipline, and sacrifice increasingly irrelevant. For no amount of Japanese determination could overcome the simple physics of a 1,200-pound rocket traveling at 500 miles per hour, carrying enough explosive power to destroy a reinforced bunker or break a destroyer's keel. Launched from beyond the range of defensive weapons by pilots who could return to strike again and again, a sustainable technological solution to tactical problems that Japan tried to solve through unsustainable human sacrifice. Years after the war, when former enemies had become allies, Japanese self-defense force officers studying at American military institutions would often request demonstrations of the Tiny Tim rocket, not from nostalgia but from professional interest in understanding the weapon that had so dramatically demonstrated the transformation of aerial warfare, and American instructors would note the mixture of admiration and regret in their Japanese counterparts' reactions: admiration for the engineering achievement and regret that their nation had failed to recognize how fundamentally the nature of warfare had changed, fighting the war of 1945 with the mindset of 1941 while facing an enemy that was already developing the weapons of the future.